On the 13th of August, 2025, at 4:23 in the morning, a silence was broken along the border of Mali and Burkina Faso. In the darkness of the caves, an operation unfolded that would send shockwaves across the Sahel. It was swift, it was precise, and it was devastating. 107 armed militants, men who had brought fear to villages and towns for years, were eliminated in a single coordinated strike. Not a single Burkinabé soldier was lost. Weapons were captured. Foreign currency was uncovered. Communications revealed international links that reached far beyond Africa's borders. This was Operation Cave Strike, and it was more than a military victory. It was proof that African armies, when trained, disciplined, and properly equipped, can secure their own future without waiting for outside approval. Do not miss what comes next. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell because this report will take you deeper into the events of that night, the reactions that followed, and the larger battle for Africa's sovereignty that is still unfolding. The caves were only the beginning. The real story reaches much further. On the morning of August the 13th, 2025, at precisely 4:23, the silence of the Sahel was broken. Along the rugged caves near the border of Mali and Burkina Faso, a mission long in the making reached its decisive moment. For months, intelligence had been gathered, satellites scanning the desert, drones tracing unusual movement, local defense forces risking their lives to provide information from the ground. Every detail was studied, every possibility calculated. And when the time came, Burkina Faso's forces moved with precision. The operation was given a name, Cave Strike. It was not chosen lightly. These caves had been strongholds for militants for years, hidden fortresses where weapons were stored and plans were made. To strike here was to strike at the heart of terror in the Sahel. The mission unfolded in 4 phases. Phase 1, surveillance. Turkish drones, silent and unseen, hovered for days, confirming positions without alerting the enemy. Phase 2, the first blow. Russian helicopters, armed with precision missiles, destroyed escape routes and struck weapons depots. Phase 3, the assault. Special units of Burkina Faso advanced, supported by armored vehicles, storming the cave entrances with a discipline born of rigorous training. Phase 4, the sweep. The remaining fighters were eliminated, supplies secured, evidence collected. The results were beyond expectation. 107 militants confirmed dead. 0 casualties among the Burkinabé forces. Entire stockpiles of rocket launchers, explosives, and heavy machine guns were seized. Vehicles, motorcycles, and communications equipment were captured intact. Even more shocking, foreign currency amounting to $500,000, euros and pounds, was found. Crisp bills that told a story of funding from beyond Africa's borders. Colonel Boubacar Samfo, the operation commander, made it clear. This was not luck. It was the fruit of months of planning, of discipline, of coordination, and it was carried out entirely by African hands. No foreign boots on the ground. No Western commanders issuing orders. African intelligence, African soldiers, African victory. The symbolism was as powerful as the numbers. For years, many in the West had claimed that African armies could not handle such operations on their own. That without outside intervention, terror would always reign. But in that one night, Burkina Faso proved otherwise. Cave Strike demonstrated that, with the right tools and the right leadership, African nations could dismantle threats that had once seemed insurmountable. The echoes of that battle spread far beyond the caves. Villages that had lived in fear for years awoke to a new reality. The message was unmistakable. Nowhere is safe for those who spread terror. And for the first time in a long time, the people of Burkina Faso could look to their soldiers and know, this army will protect us. Yet as decisive as this victory was, it was not the end. The strike was a turning point, but also a revelation. For in the documents, the currencies, and the captured communications, a darker truth began to surface. Terror in the Sahel was not acting alone. It had backers, it had networks, it had support reaching far beyond Africa's borders. And that discovery would ignite questions that no battlefield victory could fully answer. Who was truly behind the chaos in the Sahel? And how far would they go to keep Africa divided? The dust had barely settled from the caves when news of the operation began to spread. At first, the details were whispered, numbers too overwhelming to believe, a victory too complete to seem real. But confirmation came swiftly. Reports from the battlefield, photographs of seized weapons, testimonies from villagers. All spoke with one voice. Something historic had taken place on August the 13th. In Burkina Faso's capital, Ouagadougou, the streets erupted. Thousands poured out, waving flags, chanting the name of Captain Ibrahim Traoré. To many, he was no longer just a young officer who had taken power. He was now the man who had delivered what no one thought possible. In Niger and Mali, and even in distant Nairobi and Accra, celebrations were reported. Social media lit up across the continent. Hashtags such as Cave Strike Victory and Africa Can Win surged to millions of shares within hours. And in an age where narratives are fought online as fiercely as they are on the battlefield, the symbolism mattered. Leaders across the Sahel gave public statements. Mali's Colonel Assimi Goïta declared that Burkina Faso's achievement was proof that, when African armies stand united, no enemy can prevail. Niger's General Abdourahmane Tiani spoke of a victory that belongs not to one nation, but to every people of the Sahel. From South Africa, President Cyril Ramaphosa affirmed that the operation demonstrated the power of African solutions to African problems. The words echoed across the continent. This was no isolated event, but a beacon for Africa's sovereignty. But while the continent celebrated, other voices painted a darker picture. Western outlets offered minimal coverage, often burying the event under other headlines. And when they did mention it, the focus was not on the victory, but on the ongoing instability. A German publication, Junge Welt, warned that despite Cave Strike, the security situation in the Sahel was deteriorating. It pointed to coordinated attacks in Niger and Mali, where dozens of soldiers had fallen in recent weeks. It reported massacres in places like Djibo, northern Burkina Faso, where militants had struck with brutality only months earlier. The analysis was sobering. Groups such as JNIM and the so-called Islamic State in the Greater Sahara were no longer carrying out random raids. They were following a strategy. They were seizing temporary control of towns, demonstrating power, then retreating before reinforcements could arrive. They were expanding westward, embedding themselves in regions like K's, once thought safe. They were exploiting ethnic tensions, particularly within the Fulani community, drawing recruits by feeding resentment and despair. The message was clear. While Cave Strike was a triumph, it was not the end of the struggle. The networks of terror had been shaken, yes, but not destroyed. And behind those networks stood deeper forces, financiers, arms dealers, and political interests that no single battle could erase. For the people of Burkina Faso, the emotions were mixed. Relief, pride, and hope surged in equal measure. Villages liberated from militant control rejoiced as families returned to their homes. Markets reopened. Schools prepared to welcome children once more. But in the back of every celebration was the knowledge that the fight was not finished. Terror had been wounded, but terror was not yet gone. This is the paradox of Cave Strike. It was the most successful anti-terrorist operation in modern Sahel history, a demonstration of what African unity and discipline can achieve, and yet it was also a reminder of the scale of the challenge still looming. Victories can inspire, but wars are not won in a single night. So the question must be asked, was Cave Strike the turning point that will finally break the cycle of violence? Or was it only one battle in a longer war yet to come? The immediate consequences of Cave Strike were undeniable. In the days that followed, militant groups across the Sahel were thrown into disarray. Intelligence confirmed that fighters abandoned other cave complexes, fearing similar strikes. Planned attacks were canceled after communications were compromised. Recruitment slowed, as potential recruits questioned whether these movements could truly protect them. Neighboring nations were quick to act. In Mali and Niger, joint operations were launched, modeled on the tactics used in Cave Strike. With intelligence shared across borders, additional strikes eliminated 67 more militants in the weeks that followed. For the first time in years, coordination across Sahel armies seemed to be moving ahead of terrorist networks, rather than lagging behind. Perhaps most powerful of all were the scenes in the liberated villages. 12 communities in northern Burkina Faso, long under militant occupation, were returned to government control. Over 8,000 civilians were able to return home. Markets reopened. Humanitarian aid flowed again along roads once blocked. A village chief, Ibrahim Traoré, spoke with a voice filled with relief. Our children can go to school. Our women can work in the fields without fear. The soldiers came like lightning and drove the terrorists away. Yet beneath the joy lay deeper questions. For years, Groups like JNIM and the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara have thrived not only through weapons, but through strategy. They embed themselves in rural communities, exploit grievances, and recruit among the poor. They have targeted the Fulani people in particular, a community spread across West Africa, often marginalized and left without support. By presenting themselves as protectors, the militants have turned despair into allegiance. The danger is this. Every military victory risks creating resentment if innocent civilians are caught in the crossfire, or if entire communities feel they are being collectively punished. Reports in international outlets warn that Fulani civilians, already suspected by governments, have sometimes suffered unjust treatment during anti-terror operations. This cycle, recruitment through grievance, crackdown through suspicion, feeds the very instability that terrorists exploit. That is why Cave Strike, as successful as it was, cannot stand alone. It showed what is possible when discipline and technology meet courage. But it also revealed what lies beneath the surface. Terror is not only a military force, it is a political weapon, a social disease, a challenge to legitimacy. Without addressing those layers, victory on the battlefield risks being temporary. This is the uncomfortable truth. Yes, the numbers matter. 107 militants killed, 0 casualties for Burkina Faso's forces, entire stockpiles of weapons seized. But beyond the numbers lies the deeper struggle for territory, for trust, and for the soul of a nation. Militants retreat today, but they may regroup tomorrow. Villages celebrate now, but fear lingers at the edges of memory. Soldiers are heroes, but they must remain guardians, not occupiers. It is here that the question must turn to you, the audience. Do you believe that Africa's war against terror will be won only with bullets and bombs? Or do you believe, as many argue, that the true victory will be won in schools, in jobs, in justice, and in the dignity of ordinary people? Cave Strike has given us a glimpse of what is possible, but it has also reminded us of the cost of delay, of neglect, of underestimating those who thrive in chaos. So the question remains, is this the dawn of a new era, or merely a pause in a war that has yet to reach its fiercest stage? Beyond the borders of Burkina Faso, the shockwaves of Cave Strike reached far. Across Africa, leaders and citizens alike celebrated it as proof that the continent could defend itself. But outside Africa, the reactions were far more restrained. Western news outlets gave little attention to the scale of the operation. When they did report it, the headlines often emphasized ongoing instability rather than the unprecedented success. They pointed to the broader rise in militant attacks, the fragility of governments, the poverty of the region, anything but the fact that an African army had just carried out one of the most decisive anti-terror operations in decades. For France, the former colonial power in the Sahel, the silence was even heavier. Only a few years earlier, French troops had been present in the region under Operation Barkhane, yet the violence had continued to escalate. Their withdrawal left many questioning whether the West had ever been committed to real stability. Now, with Burkina Faso showing results without foreign boots on the ground, the contrast was sharp and uncomfortable. Even in the United States, where Africa often receives little coverage, the operation did not go unnoticed among military circles. Colonel James Mitchell, a retired U.S. Special Forces officer, commented that Cave Strike demonstrated tactical and technological superiority that most Western armies would struggle to match in similar terrain. It was a rare admission. Africa was not simply catching up. In some ways, it was setting a new standard. Yet these acknowledgments were rare, scattered, and often overshadowed by skepticism. Analysts in Western capitals continued to focus on the risks, the possibility of insurgents regrouping, the challenges of governance, the persistence of poverty. All of these are real concerns, but the omission was telling. Why was there no recognition of success, only warnings of failure? For African audiences, and especially for those in the diaspora, the question cuts deeper. Why are African victories so often ignored? Why does the global narrative so rarely show Africans as capable of protecting their own sovereignty? And why, when the evidence is clear, does recognition remain so reluctant? This silence is itself a revelation. It suggests that Cave Strike was not only a military breakthrough, it was a political statement. It challenged old assumptions about dependency, about control, about whose victories are deemed legitimate. And so the question remains, if the world refuses to celebrate Africa's success, then who will stand with Africa as it prepares for the battles yet to come? Cave Strike was more than a battlefield triumph. It was a declaration of possibility. But declarations must be followed by discipline, and victories must be followed by vision. The road ahead for Burkina Faso and for the wider Sahel is long, complex, and filled with challenges that no single operation can erase. The first task is consolidation. An army that has shown its strength must now show restraint. To keep the trust of the people, Burkina Faso's forces must remain protectors, not occupiers. Every village liberated must become a village rebuilt, schools reopened, markets revived, health clinics restored. Security cannot exist without dignity. The second task is cooperation. Terrorism in the Sahel does not respect borders, and neither can the response. Already, Mali and Niger have taken steps to replicate Cave Strike's tactics, but the future demands more: joint intelligence networks, shared equipment, and coordinated operations across the alliance of Sahel states. For too long, foreign powers defined the security of Africa. Now the AES must prove that Africans can defend Africa together. The third task is preparation. Militants have been weakened, but they will adapt. They will shift tactics, exploit ethnic tensions, and search for new safe havens. To counter them requires more than weapons. It requires jobs for the young, justice for the marginalized, and inclusion for communities long pushed aside. The Fulani question remains central. If they continue to feel excluded, militants will continue to find recruits. The battle for the Sahel is not only a military campaign, it is a campaign for hearts and minds. Finally, there is the broader vision. Cave Strike is a symbol of something greater: the African Renaissance in security. For decades, the story of African armies has been written by outsiders, trained abroad, commanded by foreign advisors, dependent on external approval. But August the 13th showed another path. African commanders, using African intelligence, African equipment, and African strategies, achieved what many thought impossible. The future will demand endurance. Victories like Cave Strike ignite hope, but only persistence can secure lasting peace. The Sahel struggle is not only against militants, but against the weight of history, poverty, and external interference. It is a struggle to prove, once and for all, that African nations can rise on their own terms. And so the question hangs before us. Will Cave Strike be remembered as the spark of a new era, or just a single bright flame in a darkness that has yet to pass? Operation Cave Strike was not simply a victory counted in numbers. It was 107 militants eliminated. It was 0 Burkinabé casualties. It was weapons seized, foreign funds exposed, and networks revealed. But beyond the figures, it was a statement. A statement that Africa is no longer defined by weakness, dependency, or failure. For too long, outside powers shaped the story of the Sahel. They spoke of endless instability, of hopeless battles, of nations unable to stand. Yet on the 13th of August, 2025, Burkina Faso stood. It stood with courage. It stood with discipline. And it proved to the world that an African army could deliver what many had said was impossible. Still, we must not deceive ourselves. Terror will not disappear overnight. The militants remain. Their strategy is evolving. The risks are real. The sorrow of places like Djibo, where civilians and soldiers fell only months earlier, is still fresh. This is the tension of our time. Great victories beside deep wounds. And yet, hope is rising. From Ouagadougou to Bamako, from Niamey to Johannesburg, people are beginning to believe again. The idea of an Africa that defends itself, that builds its own security, that answers only to its people, this idea is alive. The celebration of Cave Strike is not just for Burkina Faso, it is for a continent searching for dignity and sovereignty. This is why we must keep telling the story. We must share it, repeat it, let it echo. Type in the comments, African military victory. Share this report so others will know what was achieved. And subscribe, because more than news, this is a movement. This is not the end. It is the beginning. The beginning of an Africa that no longer waits for permission. The beginning of an era where sovereignty is non-negotiable. The beginning of what some are calling the African Renaissance. Remember this name, Ibrahim Traoré. Remember this land, Burkina Faso. When history records this chapter, it will not speak of dependency, but of determination. It will not speak of silence, but of strength. Ibrahim Traoré. News is not just about one leader. It is about a generation rising. And Burkina Faso news is not just about one nation. It is about a continent reclaiming its voice. Ibrahim Traoré. News will continue to remind us. Africa can stand. Africa will stand.